is Kristina Touzenis, and I'm head of international migration law at the International Organization for Migration. The organization is an intergovernmental organization, part of the UN system, and we've been in existence for more than 65 years now. We were created in 51 and then developed the structure, and the size of it has developed considerably since then, obviously. We've always had as a mandate to serve migrants and states, helping states in managing and governing migration better. Clearly, lately, can be seen as a challenge. Now we are focusing a lot on the implementation of what is called the Global Compact on Migration, which is a non-binding instrument which was adopted or will be adopted formally in December this year, 2018, where UN member states have come together and tried to create a document which is a set of 23 objectives on how to govern migration better globally. It shouldn't just be a document, obviously. It is very concrete objectives that states can or should work towards obtaining so that we get better global governance on migration. And even if it is a non-binding instrument, it's firmly based in international legal standards we already have. It has been a state-led process, so it's something that states actually agreed upon, which in itself is a major step, because up until now migration has perhaps not been so present in the global agenda where states actually came together and spoke about it and agreed upon something. So we're focusing a lot our work on the practical implementation of this new document. My role as head of international migration law is, I always say, simply put, it's twofold. It's internal in supporting our offices around the world and other divisions here at headquarters, where I am, in making sure that whatever we do has a rights-based approach, that whatever we do is based on international standards, as well as working on developing policies and doing advocacy with other UN agencies, academia, NGO, on, let's say, frontier issues. And then it is advocacy outside the organization with other counterparties, such as the member state, trying to help member states better implementing their international obligations, both by awareness raising as well as with concrete suggestions as to how this can come about. I think international law gives that very strong basis for how societies can be regulated in a way that promotes fairness. I think that a lot of people don't really understand, but not because they're stupid, but simply because they don't get that information. Perhaps they don't even need it, but these days I actually think they do. I don't think a lot of people grasp how international law actually influences their daily lives, because human rights and whatever else we have in the international legal framework regulates how states should behave towards the individuals on their territory or under their jurisdiction, right? It also put up rules for how states should regulate interactions between individuals. If, for instance, we talk about social rights, the rights to housing, there is a right for all of us to have adequate housing, which also means that we are protected against being thrown out on the street from our apartments, which were rented from one day to another. And respect for this legal framework really means that we create a society of peace where people have the possibility to prosper, and if they are not able to prosper, then they will get some sort of aid to get through a period of difficulty. When I walk home from here tonight, I don't have to fear particularly that some criminal individual is going to attack me, because I'm in a place where most people are able to make a living, and they don't, out of poverty, want to take what I have, right? Because they don't have any other choice. I don't have to fear arbitrary arrest from the police, because the police knows that they need to respect my rights. I have a home to go home to where I can close my door and feel safe. I can go to the supermarket and I can buy something to eat which is of quite good quality. And those are all actually implementation of rights that we find in international treaties. And I think it's very important that we start communicating better why it is the international framework has a direct impact on the lives of everybody. Because a lot of people do not realize this. They do not realize that the peace, prosperity that they have been benefiting from since practically Second World War is not granted. And it's something that our grandparents and our parents fought to achieve. The international legal framework is there to hold power accountable. Very often power doesn't like to be held accountable. And as individuals, we are always much, much weaker than the state, because the state has an entire apparatus, right? It's like, as employees, we are very often much, much weaker than our employer, because the employer is big business or an organization that has a power and money that as individuals we don't have. And we do need, as individuals, stand up for our rights, because they're not granted to us automatically. Those of us who have had them haven't had them respected because we did something to deserve it, but because we were lucky to be born into societies where these rights were respected. And those of us who these days flee or migrate because their rights are not respected did nothing to deserve that either. They're not less deserving than those of us who have been lucky. I think that those are things that we need to communicate much better. And we also need to communicate much better why this system was set up. It was set up after the 2 world wars, where humanity had been staring down to the abyss and thought, we don't want to go there again. We don't want to have rise of nationalisms where some people can legitimately be persecuted. We want a fair society where we can all live in peace. And I don't know if for too long some of us, particularly when we talk about migration in destination states, have been living in peace for too long so that we've forgotten this. And I think there's a lot of education to be done in what happens when we start taking our rights for granted. What happens when we start thinking that rights are only for us because we were lucky to have them respected all our lives, and the others for some reason don't deserve it, because it's a very slippery slope. When we talk about migration, it seems to be completely legitimate these days to take rights away from migrants. Migrants, legally speaking, have the same rights as you and me. And if we as populations allow this to happen, then my question will be, who's next? Because if we start denying rights to people who legally have rights for one group of people, then another group of people will follow. And I think we're already starting a little bit to see who's next, and it's the judiciary. Because the judiciary is under attack in a number of states because they're trying to hold on and uphold the rights that all individuals have. And people let that happen because they don't realize that the judiciary is incredibly important to them. It's something that's far removed. Unless you have to go before a judge, you don't think about this part of the, let's say, professional population as something that's important to you. But they are, because they are there upholding your rights on a daily basis. And if we allow those sorts of attacks, well, we are letting go of our democracy slowly.
Can you give us an example of what you're saying about this next step on that direction?
It's happened already once in the past. Hitler did it. One of the first things he did was to delegitimize the judiciary, so there was nobody there who could actually enforce the rights that people had. I think we see it in a number of states that there is a discourse that tries to delegitimize the judiciary. or either by pretending that they're politicized, or having discourses that makes their decisions seem less legitimate. And I think it's something that people just don't feel touches upon their lives. And I think that's something also we need to really work on to make that clear, because they are there to uphold our rights and to safeguard us when something goes wrong. And that is why, for instance, in Nazi Germany, it was one of the first things to suffer, or first institutions to suffer, because it gives a lot of leeway subsequently to those who hold power to abuse it. I think that if you look back to the 1930s, 1940s in Europe, you had a discourse where you found somebody to blame for all the ills. They were Jewish people. Today we blame the migrants. I think that at that time we saw a lot of pictures of people behind fences. I think we're starting to see people behind fences again. This time the fences are less to make people kept in a specific place, more to keep people out. But again, we also see detention centers where migration detention is used in probably an arbitrary way. But I think it's more important on the, let's say, for the larger picture, that once you start presenting one part of the population as the cause of all ills, you take away something substantive from the political discussion. And that is basically the political discussion, because nobody talks about healthcare reforms, about fiscal reforms, about educational reforms, about more serious economic issues, labor reforms. Everybody's just focusing on the last boat with 50 people arriving. And at the end of the day, that last boat with about 50 people arriving is not going to have a direct impact on the lives of Signor Rossi in Italy, Mr. Smith in the UK, and Monsieur Rossignol in France. So there is a completely distorted image, first of all, of the numbers that arrive, which are really not that many percentual from a percentual perspective. But I also think that it is a distortion of what are the issues. Because if we limit migration to an issue which has the proportions that it actually has, we give space to discussions on things that actually touches upon our lives, such as education reform, agricultural reform, fiscal reform, labor reforms, labor rights for all of us, for instance, right? And right now, all of that is not being discussed, and nobody's being held accountable for what they're doing on those issues, because we're only talking about migration and we're only voting about migration. And at the end of the day, I work for the International Organization for Migration, and I have to say, migration does not proportionately have that impact on people's daily lives as it's presented to be. I don't think I can actually pinpoint when it started, but if you look to recent history, in the 70s you had very good labor migration schemes, both in the destination countries in Europe, bringing labor migrants in to fill a void, as well as in the US. And actually migration was much better controlled, because there's also the entire discussion on control, right? We need to control our borders. When you know who's coming in for what purpose, in other words, when you have legal channels for migration, so people can move with the purpose to work, for family reunification, seasonal work, more permanent work, for studying, you have a good picture of who's coming in, what for, how long are they going to stay, what are their possibilities to renew their permit, and so on and so forth. In the 70s you had that, and for instance in the US you had a lot of seasonal workers coming from Mexico, going in, going back. At a certain point, and I'm guessing, but this is not scientific, but it must coincide with some sort of economic crisis. we started having a much more, now we need to close our borders, now we need to control our borders. And in many cases we managed to do the exact opposite, because people will migrate when either they are forced to do so because they're being persecuted, so that they are refugees, or they are forced to do so because of war, or because they feel that they have no other options because where they live does not give them any possibilities to actually sustain a living. And they will migrate to places where there's a labor market to fill. Because I think that's another myth we need to demolish right away, and that is, people don't come to destination states to drift around on the street and do nothing. People come to fill a labor market need. And that's one of the reasons why we always say we need to have what we call a whole of government approach, so that migration is not only in the hands of very often the Ministry of Interiors who have the security approach, but that there is a coordination with the Ministry of Social Affairs, with Ministry of Health, and very, very importantly, with the Ministry of Labour, so that they can say, okay, what we actually need are these people to come in regularly. Because most people who migrate for labor purposes, who come in irregularly, will work. And they're not doing something irregular, they're not doing something illegal, they're picking tomatoes, they're working in sweatshops, producing our clothes, carrying out complete legal activities, but in a fashion that doesn't respect national labor laws very often. So they actually also, this sort of lack of legal channels, which would allow people to come in regularly, find jobs regularly, also is a threat to the national labor force, much more than it would be if we had legal channels, because people being on the margins, irregular migrants, employers are not mean people, but there is a possibility there to not give them minimum wages, to not give them the vacation days that they are entitled to have them work many more hours than the national labor force would do. So it's actually an unfair competition. Whereas if you had these people come in a regular way, filling the labor markets, then you could say also, well, they are laborers and they are here regularly, we know where they are, we know what they're doing, we can enforce their labor rights, so they will start competing at the same level as nationals. That said, it's also true that many migrants work in sectors that the nationals are actually not interested in working in. But that's a parallel issue, so to speak. What we have done by not having this attention to what would actually be a much better long-term and sustainable migration governance, which corresponds to our labor market in destination states, is to say we don't let people in for labor purposes, or we have quotas which are much smaller than what we actually need, and then people will be smuggled in or trafficked in, and we don't know who they are and we don't know what they're doing. We know that they are in the hands of criminal organizations, so we are to a certain extent giving business to criminal organizations. But if we talk from a control perspective, isn't it much, much better to get the majority of people in to work or with family reunification or because they need international protection, knowing who they are, where they are, what they're doing, and thereby diminishing the number of people trying to come in irregularly substantively, because then those are only the only people we need to actually control and to find out what are their connections to international criminal organizations, for instance. We could drastically reduce those numbers if we had legal channels. And in the 70s, that's what we had. And that's also why you see that, for instance, the Convention on Transnational Organized Crime, with the two protocols which are relevant for migration, which is the protocol on smuggling and the protocol on trafficking, comes into being in 2000. We take a long time creating international instruments because we need to discuss every little comma. That's a process that starts in probably the 80s, where we begin to see a closure of borders and therefore an increase in smuggling and increase in trafficking. Because these people who smuggle and traffic are responding to a hole in a gap in the labor market. They wouldn't be able to exploit people if these people weren't doing something, right? They are filling gaps which could be filled with regular migration. And another point to make, I think, is that when we say having legal channels, we don't say open borders. It's a question of better governance, so that we actually have people coming in legally and diminishing the number of irregular migrants. We're not saying we're just going to open the borders and not know what's going on. Absolutely not. It's quite the contrary. Why is it so easy to blame the migrant population? Well, first of all, they don't vote. So you can do more or less whatever you want with them because they're never going to hold you accountable. And then it's on the basis of a discourse which is us versus them. You create an us, which are those of us who deserve to have our rights, simply because we've had them all our lives, more or less. And the others who are coming to very often steal both our jobs and our social security. I've never understood how they steal both. I mean, either they steal our social security or they steal our jobs. They can't steal both, right? So it's on the basis of a discourse which is very much us versus them. And it is also a very simplified discourse. Because if I present a problem which can be solved by closing our borders can't be closed. Our labor market issues will not be solved even if we could. But that's what is presented like. Then the people voting, the nationals voting, will think this is an easy way to solve our issues. And the more complex discourse, I will start that sentence again, the more complex discourse showing numbers, showing why there is a need for migrant labor, showing also why we cannot attack one group of people without endangering the rights of everybody else, is longer. It's less catchy. And there is something that I think that those of us who want to promote that discourse really need to work on. Because I want to close borders and then I'm going to give jobs to all nationals is quickly said. Saying, no, this is not actually what's going to happen. We need the labor force. We need to respect these people's rights, because not out of solidarity, not out of I feel bad for you, but simply as a safeguard for my own rights, because otherwise I might end up being attacked, is much longer. I think we need to catch some catchy phrases and get that message out there. I also think that to a certain extent there is a play on fear. You create a fear that if these people who are different from us are coming, then you will suffer. And to a certain extent, even if it pains me to say so, I think that perhaps those of us who can see that this is not true needs to play a little bit on that fear too, but turn it around and say, if we don't respect these people, then somebody's going to attack your rights. If we don't respect the rights of everybody, nobody's going to come and protect you. I mean, there is this famous poem from, I think, Brecht, no? Who says, first they came for the communists, then they came for the gays, and then they came for the Jews, and I didn't say anything in any of these cases, and when they came for me, nobody was there to speak up. And I do want to make this point that the international system, legal system, which is reflected in national systems, granting all of us protection and rights, is endangered and will have a massive effect on you personally if we don't stand up for rights these days, no matter for whom, because otherwise we are on a very slippery slope. And it's taken us decades to get to the point where we are today in countries where rights are respected. And I think that that's what's scary. That is that it is the countries that used to be the beacons of rights protection and democracy, which are seemingly going backwards, starting with the migrants. And then we have to get people to ask themselves, who's going to protect me if I let this happen? I just wanted to go back to the discourse about safeguarding everybody's rights, and the fact that there is obviously a point to be made that nationals who are not doing well don't want to see migrants getting additional services. And I think it all comes down to the principle of non-discrimination. It's about doing the best we can for everybody who is in need. And I think there are some societies where we are better, some states that are better in going in and catching people before they end up on the street, before they get thrown out of their houses, before they don't have anything to eat. And then there are other societies that are less well equipped to do so. But I think it really does come down to the principle of non-discrimination, that it is inevitable that some people fall through the cracks. I wish they didn't, but I think we need to try our best to go and catch those people, no matter what nationality they have, and then offer the services to make them come back on their feet. Because human rights is not about granting services ad infinitum. It's about creating a condition so people can live on their own effort. For instance, in a welfare state, if you lose your job, you have a number of months, 1 year, 2 years, where you receive quite substantive help. But that's not so that you can just sit back and do nothing, right? It's so that you have that moment to find a new job. But if you don't have anything, then you're not capable of doing what you need to do to find a new job. You're not capable of getting back on your feet if you don't get the opportunity. And that's what it's about for nationals and as well as for non-nationals who are on your territory. And that's why I speak much more about opening up legal channels, because let's not be warm and fuzzy about this. An irregular migrant does not have the right to stay on the territory, so can be returned home. But I think we need to think way beyond that and say, why is that irregular migrant on our territory? Is that irregular migrant working? Why is that migrant not regular? Because no matter the status, anybody on the territory working contributes to our economy, contributes to our society. But they contribute more when they're regular. Just as well as the employer contributes much more when he or she is forced to obey labor legislation, because they pay into social services schemes and so on and so forth. So it's not only the irregular migrant working that's suffering the conditions, it's society as a whole, because we are being deprived of a lot of resources that the employer ought to pay into the tax system, for instance, as well as the irregular migrant ought to pay. But make no mistake, simply by working, these people are contributing to our societies and our economies. So it's a question of non-discrimination more than anything else. I also want to make the point, I think, that in very many cases these days, local level municipalities, regions, not multinational regions, but small regions and countries, do an amazing job in integration and do an amazing job in safeguarding rights for everybody who is on their territory, because they see that it works. At the local level, on a daily basis, mayors and regional, whatever we call them in different countries, need to make their societies work and prosper. And they see that respect for rights for everybody, good integration, is a much better way of having their municipality thrive. And they also need to prove more directly to their electorate on a much more close basis that they can actually make the city work, for instance, right? And they see the benefits of it. You can see New York. You can see a lot of the sanctuary cities which are popping up in the States. You can see municipalities in Sicily, for instance, doing this. Getting away from this discourse you have at the national level, which at the end of the day doesn't correspond to reality. And I think that's very interesting, and that's something to explore. So this new concept of solidarity crime, if you just dissect the concept, it makes me shiver. I mean, you are being criminalized because you're showing solidarity. And it's not aiding and abetting somebody who has committed a bank robbery. Yeah? It's giving blankets, it's giving food to people who are suffering. Now, the state has an obligation. Every state has an obligation to everybody on their territory, under their jurisdiction, to provide them with aid in the sense shelter, water, food, education, if they're staying long enough. The fact that the state is not doing this is one thing. Because let's say the state is not capable, then in many cases, also when I say the state is supposed to do this, in many cases it's not a state actor providing these things. It's NGOs, it can be international organizations, it's non-state actors. What the state is supposed to do to live up to its international obligation is to allow this and facilitate this. So nobody is without shelter, national or not. Nobody is without food. So it's also allowing soup kitchens, for instance, for those who are most marginalized. If you start directly preventing this, you are in violation of international human rights law. Now, I'm not saying, and I think this is an important point to be made, we're not saying that if you have unreasonable migration policies that do not correspond at all to your labor market needs, and therefore you have a lot of irregular migrants on your territory, that you cannot send them back. You can. It's your prerogative as a state. But the moment they are on your territory, and as long as they are on your territory, you cannot deny them their rights. You might not be able to provide those rights, such as shelter and the soup kitchen, but if somebody else is, they are basically implementing your obligations. If you prevent them from doing so, you're violating your international obligations. And you are, as we were talking about before, attacking the next group of people. The people who are actually opposed to your policies. So you are, in a certain sense, criminalizing the opposition to your policies. We saw that before too, right? We saw that again in the 30s and in the 40s. And I really think we need to take a history lesson, because I don't think we want to see a repetition of what happened then.
You were talking about this this prerogative of deporting people.
Mm-hmm.
And return.
Let's say returning, because you have the prerogative to return, either telling people now you need to go home and hoping that they do so, the prerogative or the possibility to have a return program with IOM, for instance, that helps you go home voluntarily. And the very last resort is a deportation, where you actually have a deportation order, which very often includes a prohibition to go back into that country for 5 to 10 years. So we want to avoid that. Even when it's legitimate to return, we would like to see that there are lesser forced returns, deportations, because it has much more long-term implications for the individual.
Okay, I made a mistake because I'm not a lawyer, but
no,
it's true.
Yeah.
But you mentioned two keywords for me. One was home, and the second one was returning. And actually, I think many people who's actually escaping from their places, they don't feel that they still have a home.
I think that I may have simplified when I said home and returning home. There is the prerogative of the state when you don't have fear for persecution, or when you don't have fear of war, for instance, to be returned to your country of habitual residence or nationality. Whether or not you feel that's home is then another question, and that opens up for an entirely different question about the voluntariness of migration these days. Because if you look at what we call forced migration, it is refugees in the classical sense based on the Refugee Convention, where you flee persecution, or in the more ample sense where you flee generalized violence, grave human rights violations. Because if you look at the refugee definition, it comes out of the Second World War. So it's actually war is not included in the convention fleeing war is included in regional instruments, because there's a realization of the fact that you don't only fear the persecution we saw in Nazi Germany, you also flee war. You would flee Syria these days, you would flee many places where there is armed conflict and where the civilian population is at great danger. We would do it too, right? If all of a sudden bombs start falling on Geneva, I'd get the hell out of town. But the fact is that in 1951, 1951 for the convention, 51 for the creation of UNHCR, and 51 for the creation of IOM, the first IOM we had, there was a distinction between that sort of forced migration and people moving for economic reasons, which today we would call labor migration. And this latter was seen as being voluntary. The fact is that I think even in 51 you could question the voluntariness, but if you look at today's conditions that push people into moving, we still call the people who flee persecution or war forced migrants, because that's what we've been calling them for the past 65 years, and that's a terminology. But I think it's wrong to think that everybody else is just going along for the ride and having fun. I think many people don't have choices. They will either die of hunger, or because of environmental factors such as drought, or because they have no options where they live. I think that goes also beyond economic reasons. I don't think people try to move to the countries that are classical destination countries only for work. I think it's also because they see those countries as fair, as free of corruption, as democratic, and I think that they see them full of opportunities that, to be frank, you and I had. I don't come from a rich background. My grandmother went into service, like Downton Abbey style, when she was 10. I graduated from university. And that's because I grew up in a state that respected my rights, and that created this society where you could create possibilities. And I think that that's what we also need to have a very frank discussion, I think, with destination states. We also need to have a very frank discussion with states of origin about why people are moving, what are the drivers. Because it's not only poverty, it's not only lack of jobs, it's not only war, it's corruption, it's having an elite that monopolizes opportunities, and people want to be able to create better lives. So I think that there are a lot of involuntariness before you come to forced migration, and we need to look at the drivers as well as we need to look at the reception in countries where the labor is needed. I really think that we need to reduce the political discussion on migration to what it should be. I don't think it's enough to say we are countering this discourse with a positive discussion on migration. Migration has a positive impact on societies. As we just said, migrant laborers produce, be they irregular or not. I think we need to scale it back to what it ought to be in the bigger political discussion, so that we can have a fact-based discussion, we can have an honest discussion also about all the other things, and so that we start holding our politicians accountable for a lot of the other policies that they are getting approved and pushing through these days, when we're all just looking at the boat that arrived yesterday. And I think we really need to consider what this is doing to us. The negation of rights of people just like us. I think we really need to think about what it's doing to us and what it can do to us in 10 years' time. And I hope that for those of us who have lived in peace and prosperity with our rights respected, it will not take us another war to realize that we need to stand up for our rights.